At the beginning of the 20th century, a new genre of music arose. Its chords were more complex than doing your taxes, its rhythms sounded like someone running on a sprained leg. It was jazz! And ever since its invention, classical musicians have had a fascination with it. When classic and jazz are mixed, the crossover genre is sometimes referred to as third stream, which is a stupid name, so don't ever use it. We need a more appropriate name, like jazz and classical music should probably have never had a baby, but they did anyway, so let's just appreciate it for what it is and not ask questions. The past 100 years are full of these crossover compositions, the most famous of which would be Now, if you don't know this piece of music, goodness gracious, go and have a listen to it now, because I'm sure as heck not going to be covering it in this video. Rhapsody in Blue is a very good piece of music, but it is extraordinarily well known, and the last thing that you need is someone like me making a semi-humorous, semi-educational video about it. Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue in 1924, but just a year later saw the birth of another crossover work by the composer George Antheil in 1925. It was called a jazz symphony. George Antheil had been strongly influenced by contemporary European music and spent time in Europe making friends with the likes of Igor Stravinsky. As with many of his European counterparts, Antheil was interested in shocking his public, creating something unusual, dramatic, and spontaneous. And as a result, his jazz symphony contains moments in it like this. The piece is full of jazz elements and jazz cliches and genuinely interesting musical material, but it is so schizophrenic. It doesn't know what it is. It's continually changing mood and feel, material. It is very unpredictable, and it's hard to play. This was radical music for 1925. You're practically taking pop music and mixing it together with the most avant-garde composition techniques of the time. These days, you rarely hear anyone mention the name George Antheil anymore, which is a real shame, because despite how unusual this music is, it is extraordinarily original for this period in history and extremely interesting to listen to. But let's now move to Stravinsky, who was a huge influence on George Antheil. Stravinsky, like Antheil, was a big risk taker and reinvented himself as a composer several times over the course of his career. Even after tapping into a successful style of writing, Stravinsky was willing to completely change artistic direction. In 1945, Stravinsky got a commission to write for the Woody Herman Big Band. The commission resulted in one of the most unusual works of his career, the Ebony Concerto. This is awkward music. I mean, it's good music, I like it, but it's weird. We have a horn and a harp in the big band. The rhythms and the syncopations, well, they're very rigid. He didn't really try very hard to adopt a jazz style of writing at all. Look at the drum part, for example. He doesn't use it like a typical jazz drum set. He treats it as if it were a classical percussion part. Even the melodies are sometimes really weird. This is borderline heterophonic writing. The melodies are kind of playing the same thing, but then they're not. They'll start together and then they'll drift apart and then come together again. This is not normal melodic writing. But don't get me wrong, there are also a lot of jazz elements in the piece. When the piece gets into a groove, it does elicit more jazz vibes. And what's definitely exciting about the piece is that it has a very original sound. It doesn't really sound like any of Stravinsky's other compositions. In fact, it doesn't really sound like any other compositions, full stop. But let me now show you something a little bit weirder. Nobody Knows the Trouble I See is a trumpet concerto written by the German composer Bernd Alois Zimmermann. Zimmermann often used jazz elements in his works as well as 12-tone techniques, and this piece is an example of him combining those two worlds. The title for the piece comes from the well-known spiritual by the same name.
Nobody knows and the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus.
Believe it or not, the concerto directly quotes the original spiritual, but goodness gracious, do you have to be listening carefully. 12-tone music is in many ways symbolic of 20th century German culture, and early jazz spirituals are equally symbolic of the African-American struggle. And so the combination of these two genres was intended as an expression of solidarity, potentially influenced by Zimmermann's experience as a soldier during the Nazi regime and his awareness of the struggles of the black population in the US at that period in time. In any case, it makes for interesting music, and just like the other pieces we've seen, it sounds very unique. Let's look at something else weird. This is by the Russian composer Sofia Gubaidulina, and if you know any of her other works, you'll know that this is a strange one. She doesn't usually write like this at all, and if you didn't know that it was from her, you would never guess. But this is the first work we've looked at that holds a groove for a long time, and the way that she does it is very conventional. She has a bass riff over percussion and drum set, which are just repeating the same rhythmic patterns. And then on top of that riff foundation, she adds a whole bunch of other random elements. And it's almost as if these elements, they don't have to be connected in any way because the underlying groove is acting as a sort of glue which holds all of the material together. What's kind of weird though is that combining a sort of late 60s funk groove with random orchestral elements gives it a very cinematic feel. Sounds like it's from an early James Bond film. If you don't know the works of Sofia Gubaidulina, go check them out. She's one of the heroines of late 20th century art music. Now, these are just a couple of weird examples, but there are many other pieces like this that mix jazz and contemporary music. You might want to check out one of the symphonies of Wynton Marsalis, or perhaps the work Trio for orchestra, big band, choir, and video by the composer Simon Steen Anderson. There's a lot of this random sort of repertoire. So what lessons can we learn from these types of crossover compositions? I don't know.